Chapter 6. Welcome to Ponyville. She lives in a library. Her home, a tree, is actually a library. We were standing just outside of Twilight's home. She was quickly reading through her list she had brought with her, trying to figure out what to do first. I was busy studying the sign above the door that read Golden Oaks Library. I tilted my head to the side slightly, never taking my eyes off the sign. This mare either really likes books, or was so poor that she had to live in a public building. With her being a princess, I'd most likely go with the first option. "All right," Twilight finally said, rolling up the scroll and storing it in her saddlebags. "Let's head out." With a tug on the leash, she began to make her way off into the town. And what a town it was! Colorful houses everywhere, each one with some crazy design. There was a bowling alley with large pins and bowling balls decorating the outside. This building made my head hurt. How could a race of ponies with no fingers possibly bowl? There was a shop that was shaped like a purple and yellow checkered jester's hat. The sign above the door clearly labeled it as a joke shop. How fitting. Actually, it was like this whole world was one giant pun. There was even a store that was called the Quills and Sofas Shop that sold, surprisingly enough, sofas and quills. Seriously? Who thought up that combo for a shop? Those two things aren't even related to each other in the slightest. After we passed by a building that resembled a large gingerbread house, I gave up on trying to figure this town out. Instead, I just concentrated on the ground, following behind Twilight as she weaved her way through the small crowd of ponies. Most of them didn't even spare us a passing glance, and the ones who did simply waved at Twilight and kept going about their business. "I just need to make a quick stop at the bookstore before we do anything else," Twilight said to herself. I glanced up and saw that we were headed towards the store whose sign was a book hanging from its spine. I tried not to roll my eyes. Why the hell does she need to go to a bookstore? She lives in a library, for Christ's sake. Of course, I couldn't voice my opinion, so I was forced to follow her as she headed up to the door. Pushing the door open with her hoof, she quickly slipped in with me, following close behind. It was a dimly lit store, just enough light to see by, but not enough to be obnoxious. The store itself smelled of books. Beside me, Twilight inhaled deeply, a small smile on her face. I knew how she felt. I loved the smell of books as well. Slowly making our way through the rows of bookshelves, we headed towards the back of the store. Twilight browsed through the shelves, stopping every now and then if a certain book caught her eye. I simply glanced around the room. As the shelves were designed for ponies, they were only about 4 feet tall, seeing as the average height of a pony, after researching the subject, is around 3.5 feet. This meant I could easily look over the tops of the shelves with no problem. Finally reaching the back, Twilight approached the brown-coated pony behind the counter. He looked at and smiled at her, ignoring me completely. I guess ponies aren't as strict on their no pets allowed rule. "Good morning, Twilight Sparkle. How are you this fine day?" the stallion asked, closing the book he had been reading. "Good morning, Barnes. I'm doing quite well, actually, all things considered," Twilight replied, returning the smile. "Yes, I heard about the problem with the basilisk. Is every pony all right?" Barnes asked, concern showing on his face. Twilight simply giggled and waved her hoof in the air. "Oh, yes. Every pony is just fine. The only injury we had was Applejack, and that was just a sprained ankle from when she tripped over the creature's tail." Barnes visibly relaxed at the news. "Oh, good. I'd hate to think of any of you girls getting hurt dealing with that horrid beast." "It was no trouble at all, Barnes," Twilight said, shaking her head, smile still on her face. "You were simply doing our job." As they continued making small talk, I studied the stallion before me. His coat was a light brown, almost tan, and his mane was a darker shade of brown. He had neither a horn nor wings, so I guess he was just a normal pony. A pair of glasses rested on his nose, framing his dark blue eyes. There was a picture of a stack of books on his ass. His name is Barnes, and he works in a bookstore. I snickered to myself. All he needs is a partner whose name is So Barnes. How's your brother Noble doing? I haven't seen him running the store in a while. I think I'm going to cry. Eventually the two of them seemed to get tired of talking as Barnes finally leaned across the counter towards Twilight. Now, Miss Sparkle, I know you didn't come in here just to talk to an old stallion. What brings you to my humble shop? Oh, stop it, Barnes. You aren't that old, Twilight said, fishing around her in her saddlebags with a hoof. As for why I'm here, there is a book I'm looking for that doesn't appear to be in my library. I was hoping you had it. Barnes leaned back in surprise. A book that Twilight Sparkle doesn't have? Dearie me, I never thought I'd see the day, he said with mock surprise. What exactly is the name of this elusive book? Twilight pulled out her scroll and glanced at the contents. It's You're Humaning You by Dr. MacGuffin. Ah, looking for some tips on owning your own human, are we? Barnes' eyes lit up instantly, and he finally glanced in my direction. How long have you had this fine specimen? I received him last night as sort of a gift from Princess Celestia. I've never had a human before, and don't know much about them, so I was hoping to find a book that could point me in the right direction. Twilight rubbed the back of her head sheepishly. Barnes just chuckled at this. Well, I do believe I may have some copies in the back, he said, turning and heading towards the door just behind the counter. One moment, please. With that, he disappeared behind the door, leaving me and Twilight by ourselves. We sat in silence as sounds of shuffling came from the back room. Twilight's eyes flickered up to mine, and she smiled nervously. I simply cocked my head to the side, my face expressionless. Finally, Barnes returned, carrying a large book in his mouth. Placing it gently on the counter, he pushed it towards Twilight with a hoof. There you are, he said, pushing his glasses back up his nose. It was a bit tricky to find. No pony has asked for it in a long time. The book was enormous, easily the size of a dictionary. The cover was a midnight black with a silver trim running around the borders of the book. On the front cover there was a white outline of a human being. Above that was the title, You're Humaning You, written in gold cursive writing. This isn't a guidebook, it's a tome! Twilight simply glanced over the cover before nodding her head. This looks about right. How much do I owe you? She pulled the bag of coins out of her saddlebags, looking at Barnes expectantly. Rubbing his chin with his hoof, Barnes thought for a moment, calculating numbers in his head. Let's see. This isn't a rare book like you usually enjoy. However, not many ponies are asking for it. I only have 3 copies left, so... Looking at Twilight, he chewed on the inside of his cheek for several seconds. Finally, he nodded his head, smiling. For you, it'll be 50 bits. Counting out the correct number of gold coins, Twilight slid them over the counter. Barnes stowed the bits in a drawer on the other side of the counter as Twilight took the book in her magic. Thanks, Barnes. It was a pleasure doing business with you. Twilight began to make her way towards the front of the store, her nose already buried in her new book. Any time, Miss Sparkle. You're always welcome here. Waving over her shoulder at Barnes, Twilight proceeded to leave the store, pulling me behind her. I was fairly impressed. Twilight was able to navigate her way through the crowded streets without hitting another pony, while her new book hovered inches from her face. It was like watching texters back home when they walked down the street, their eyes glued to their phones. With her eyes glued to the pages, Twilight read at an abnormally fast rate. I couldn't tell if she was skimming or if she was indeed reading each word. She was getting something from it, however. She had only had to think for about 5 minutes, and she had already learned enough from the book to determine our next stop for the day. After all, it says that since humans don't have a lot of hair covering their bodies, they tend to get colder at lower temperatures, faster than ponies would. So we'll nip that in the bud right away and pay my good friend Rarity a visit. I couldn't tell if she was talking to me or the book. After a few minutes of silent reading and walking, Twilight snapped the book closed and slid it under her wing. Making her way through the crowd, she headed towards a large building at the end of the street. It looks like someone had based the building on a carousel ride. It was a tall building, at least 3 stories high, and colored with blues and purples of every hue. Large windows adorned the front of the building, showcasing pony mannequins with a variety of dresses covering them. As we neared the door, I noticed a small sign hanging over the door. Narrowing my eyes, I attempted to make out what it said. Finally, getting close enough to read it, I groaned softly and rolled my eyes. The Carousel Boutique. The buns here are going to kill me. Twilight didn't seem to notice my actions as she just continued up to the door and knocked. There was a brief moment of silence following her knock before we heard movement on the other side. "Just a minute," a sing-song voice called out. More silence followed by the sound of hooves. The door was then surrounded by a light blue aura and swung open. Standing on the other side was a very white and very pristine unicorn mare. Her indigo mane cascaded down her neck, curling and twisting in an almost impossible manner. Her blue eyes seemed to sparkle as she looked at Twilight. "Twilight, darling, what brings you to my store this fine day?" she said, hugging Twilight tightly. "Hello, Rarity," Twilight said, returning the hug. "I was actually hoping you could help me with a little problem." Rarity let go of Twilight and cocked her head. "Certainly, dear. I'd be more than happy to help. Whatever is the matter?" "I need some clothes made for my human here," Twilight said, waving a hoof at me. Rarity looked at me as if she was only just now noticing that I was standing there. Her eyes widened and her mouth opened slightly. She stayed that way for several seconds, staring up at me. Then she screamed. Now, when I say screamed, I don't mean like a little girl type of scream. I'm talking about a blood-curdling, glass-shattering, oh my god, someone's getting murdered kind of scream. The kind of scream that leaves you and everyone else around you temporarily deaf for several minutes afterwards. The scream continued for several minutes, drawing the attention of most of the passing ponies, before she finally ran out of air. Gasping and clasping her hoof to her chest, Rarity continued to stare at me in horror, mouth opening and closing wordlessly. "Twilight, why in the name of Celestia do you have that thing with you?" Rarity said shrilly, her voice finally returning to her. "Actually, Rarity," Twilight said, wincing as she rubbed a hoof in her ear, "it was Princess Celestia that sent him to me." "What could possibly possess her to do that?" Rarity's eyes never left me, as if she was afraid that the minute she looked away from me I'd attack her. I noticed that she was shivering slightly. Is she afraid of me? She said it was a belated gift for becoming a princess. She also said something about him teaching me about dealing with stress. Rarity seemed to accept that reluctantly. Licking her lips, she turned back to Twilight. "And you want me to do what again?" "I need some clothes made for him," Twilight said, smiling sheepishly. "Why?" The bluntness of the statement seemed to catch Twilight off guard. Because he needs help to stay warm?" It was more of a question than an actual answer. Rarity's eyes narrowed, glancing between Twilight and me. I didn't need to be an expert in pony expressions to know she didn't want to. Twilight apparently got the same idea as she moved to stand in front of Rarity. "Please, Rarity," she pouted, bottom lip trembling slightly. "Do this for me, then you won't have to deal with him anymore." Chewing on her bottom lip, Rarity's eyes continued to dart from Twilight to me and back again. It really didn't matter to me. I'd been naked for the past 2 weeks straight. I had gotten over my embarrassment of being in the nude, as long as no pony tried to study me too closely. Twilight, however, seemed to deem it necessary for me to have clothes. She sat there, staring at Rarity with big puppy dog eyes, her bottom lip trembling ever so slightly. "Fine, dear," Rarity eventually sighed. "Let's just do this as quickly as possible." Grabbing a tape measure from the other side of the door, Rarity approached me slowly, her legs still trembling slightly. Twilight seemed to be on edge as well, shuffling from hoof to hoof. Not wanting to end up getting hurt by a scared mare, I remained as still as possible. I may be bigger than them, but a hoof in a very uncomfortable place was something I wanted to avoid. Moving quickly, Rarity first measured across my hips, then from my hips to my ankles. Moving to my shoulders, she measured their width, then from my shoulders to my hips. Even though the tape measure was clasped in her magic, she seemed to be avoiding touching me with it, as though I was diseased. Apparently pleased with those few measurements, Rarity quickly backed away from me. "All right, that should do it," she said, turning towards Twilight. "Now, if you would follow me, I'll see what I can whip up." She walked back inside, Twilight and I following behind. We were just about to enter when Rarity glanced over her shoulder. "That thing can wait outside." Twilight opened her mouth to protest, but the look Rarity shot at her seemed to be enough. Pulling at the leash, Twilight walked me over to a bench located beside the building. Pushing the leash inside the side of the building, she fused it with the siding. She then returned to the door. Before she entered, Twilight shot me one more worried glance before entering the shop and shutting the door, leaving me outside. I grasped the leash and gave it an experimental pull, and confirmed that it wasn't going to budge. Sighing, I glanced around. The passing ponies ignored me completely, not even glancing in my direction. Convinced that I wasn't going to be able to run off, I sat on the bench and rested my head against the side of the building. I closed my eyes and sat there, simply content to listen to the sounds of the world around me. As I sat there, resting, a single thought crossed my mind. How did it come to this? I had been sitting there by myself for a while before sounds of a nearby commotion grabbed my attention. Cracking my eyes open, I glanced around for the source of the sound. Across the street I spied several ponies in golden armor approaching one of the buildings. Knocking on the door, it was answered by a pony with a pale yellow coat and a bouncy mane that was a combination of purple and pink. One of the guards waved a piece of paper in her face before they barged into the house. Several minutes later they emerged again, pulling a mint green unicorn with them. She was shackled and struggling violently. She had a strange sheath-like object over her horn. I couldn't make out what she was yelling, but she was giving them an earful. They gagged her with some cloth before pushing her into a seating position against the house. One of the guards gave a whistle and a large cart rolled into view, pulled by more guards. I sat up straighter as I got a good look at the cart. It was basically a large cage with wheels. This just got a little more interesting. Several ponies seemed to agree with me as a small crowd began to gather in front of the house. The guards formed a perimeter around the front of the house, pushing back the curious ponies. A large cage was opened, and a few of the guards entered the house again. A minute later, one of the guards exited, a human trailing behind him. He led it to the cage before pushing it inside. Another human followed the first, then another. I started to count each human that emerged from the house. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. They continued to come one human after another, males and females alike. 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28. They started to come in twos and threes. I was beginning to have some trouble counting all of them before they were shoved into the cage. 38, 43, 45, 49, 54. The cage was beginning to look cramped, humans pushing against one another as more and more of them were pushed in. 63, 68, 72, 76, 81. Finally, the waves of humans began to die down until the guard shoved one last straggler into the cage and slammed the door. That cart cage was packed. Arms and legs stuck out through the cage bars as the humans pushed against one another. I had a rough final count of 98. They had pulled 98 humans out of that one house. The cart rolled off, disappearing around the corner of the street. The guards were now talking to the pony that had opened the door, occasionally pointing to the mint green unicorn squirming on the ground. The pale yellow pony seemed to be on the verge of tears. The guards continued to talk, and the pony began to nod. I was so entranced by the scene before me that I jumped as the door beside me opened and Twilight walked out. "Thanks again, Rarity. I really appreciate this." Twilight turned to me, a small package held in her magic. She looked a little worn out, a small frown on her face. Approaching me, she slipped the package into her saddlebags. Grasping at the leash in her magic, Twilight pulled it out of the building. Rarity stuck her head out of the door, glancing at Twilight, her mane slightly disheveled now. "Any time, dear. Just please keep that thing as far away from me as possible." Pulling her head back inside, she slammed the door and flipped the sign in the window from open to close. Twilight just stared at the door for several seconds, shaking her head before turning and walking away. A quick pull on the leash and I was off behind her. "That didn't go as I expected," she muttered, head hung low. "I didn't know Rarity felt that strongly about humans." We walked in silence, heading in the opposite direction of the human-filled cart. As we walked, I began to notice that the buildings were beginning to be more spaced out. We were leaving the town. The path turned from cobblestone to dirt as we headed towards a nearby forest. Where are we heading? We walked a little bit further before the structure appeared in the distance. I almost didn't see it as it practically blended in with the surrounding area. It looked like someone had built a small cottage at the top of a small hill. A small creek ran in front of the cottage, murmuring gently. A bridge crossed the creek, connecting one side of the path to its counterpart on the other side. Birdhouses hung from every possible position around the house, as well as bird feeders. Whoever lived here appeared to be an animal lover. Hopefully that love extends to humans as well. Twilight stopped just on the other side of the creek. I stood right behind her, waiting. "I hope Fluttershy's home," she sighed, staring at the cottage. "I need some cheering up after that talk with Rarity." We proceeded to head across the bridge and up to the door. Twilight rapped on the wood with her hoof. A small "eep" came from the other side, followed by a fluttering sound. With a click, the door swung open slowly, and the pony stuck its head out of the door. Oh, hello, Twilight," the mare said, her voice barely above a whisper. She opened the door wider and stepped out. Her coat was a lovely yellow color, wings clasped at her side. Her face was partially hidden behind a large, fluffy pink mane. Oh my God. She's adorable! "Hi, Fluttershy. Do you have a second?" Twilight said, forcing a smile on her face. Of course. What do you need?" My heart nearly burst when Fluttershy tilted her head to the side. "Could you possibly take a look at my human for me?" Fluttershy glanced over at me quickly before turning back over to Twilight. "I'm not a human expert, but I'd be happy to give him a quick checkup," she said, a small smile on her face. Turning around, she flutter-trotted back into her house. Twilight followed, leading me behind her. The interior of the cottage was apparently built for creatures bigger than humans. The ceiling was high, looming several feet above my head. Despite the high ceiling, it was a homely little house where one could live comfortably. There was evidence of animals littered across the floor. A few feathers here, a couple tufts of fur there. The entire place had a calming air to it. Taking the leash from Twilight, Fluttershy led me over to a small couch and sat me down with a gentle push of her hoof. Opening her wings, she fluttered up and hovered in front of me. "Well, aren't you a nice-looking human?" she crooned, looking at me with her big cyan eyes. Clasping my hand in her hoof, she tilted it first to the left, then to the right, studying my features, humming softly as she worked. Placing a hoof on my chin, she pushed down, forcing my mouth open. Leaning in slightly, she studied my teeth. "His teeth appear to be in excellent condition. Most humans have yellowing teeth, but his are more of a whitish hue," she said, leaning back and releasing my jaw. She slowly moved down my body, studying and prodding as she went. When she reached my ribs, she paused, frowning slightly. She prodded my side with her hoof, causing me to squirm slightly. She prodded me again, and I fought the urge to laugh. I was ticklish, and her soft pokes were hitting the right spots. "He appears to be slightly malnourished," she finally said, glancing back at Twilight, who perked up. She stood up and walked over to the hovering Pegasus, leaning in to get a better look. "You should barely be able to see his ribs, but as you can see," Fluttershy said, rubbing a hoof across my exposed ribs, "his ribs are more pronounced." She continued to rub the hoof across my ribs, a small frown on her face as she continued to study me. The motion was actually nice, and was quite smoothing. He wasn't fed properly. Turning to Twilight, she left her hoof on my chest. Where did you get him from? Princess Celestia sent him to me last night. She said that you found him in a group of humans that some traders were taking to the market at Canterlot, Twilight said, tilting her head slightly. Why? Whoever was taking care of him wasn't doing it properly. He's clearly been underfed. They weren't giving him the proper amount of food on a daily basis. Fluttershy took her hoof and grabbed my hand with it. I felt her hoof grip my hand. It reminded me of a suction cup. Lifting my hand up for Twilight to see, she pointed at my wrist with her free hoof. The skin around my wrist was still red, raw from the rope bindings that I had worn for the past 2 weeks. You can also see where his wrists have been bound. He had ropes around his wrists when he arrived at the library last night, but I removed them before I went to bed. Twilight stared at my wrist, a strange expression on her face. It's possible the princess had him bound before she sent him, just to make sure he didn't freak out and attack me. Fluttershy shook her head, releasing my hand. No, she said, staring off into the distance, almost in a trance. It would have taken longer than that for his wrist to get in that state. His wrist would have to have been bound for over a week. Twilight studied Fluttershy with a hard look, sucking lightly on her cheek. Are you suggesting that the traders the princess ran into were treating their humans poorly? Twilight finally asked, her voice calm. It's possible, yes, Fluttershy replied, snapping out of her trance. The two mares were silent for a while, both lost in thought. I'll write to the princess when I get back home. Hopefully she'll be able to shed some light on the situation, Twilight finally said. Fluttershy nodded in agreement. Returning her attention back to me, she continued her examination. For someone who claims not to be a human expert, she picked up on those signs fairly quickly. I mused as she worked down my body again. He seems to be rather muscular, she said, slowly running a hoof over my abs. He's not the most muscular human I've seen. Those belong to Applejack. He is rather fit, though, considering his malnourished state. She continued moving down, her hoof dancing across my skin as she worked. Okay, we're getting a little too low there. Unable to voice my complaints, I was forced to sit there and wait as she moved down to my groin. Spreading my legs slightly with her hoof, she leaned in slightly before gasping and jerking up quickly. Oh my, she stammered, her face growing red. Her wings seemed to lock up and she landed on the floor with a soft thump. Twilight looked at the Pegasus curiously, tilting her head to the side. What's the matter? Twilight asked, inching closer to the flustered mare. Fluttershy? Fluttershy looked at Twilight, her face crimson. She tried in vain to hide behind her mane, clearly embarrassed. What did you expect when you went looking down there? Fluttershy squeaked, turning redder, if that was even possible. He has an impressively sized... She trailed off at the end. Twilight just looked more confused. Come on, does she have to paint you a picture? Fluttershy refused to meet Twilight's eyes, instead watching her hoof as she drew circles on the floor. Could you repeat that? Twilight asked, leaning closer. His member is larger than most humans, Fluttershy managed to say, refusing to look up. Twilight's face immediately lit up as well, her wings snapping out. The wing thing must have something to do with arousal. I was now sitting there, glancing between the two flustered mares, each one unable to look at the other. Twilight was the first to recover. Finally glancing at Fluttershy, she cleared her throat. Anything else? Nope. He appears to be in good health, except for being slightly underweight and having injuries on his wrist. Fluttershy gave me a final look over, avoiding my crotch. I just make sure you're keeping him well fed and hydrated, as well as give him plenty of space to wander freely. Landing, Fluttershy shuffled backward slightly, picking the end of a leash up in her mouth. Twilight approached, taking the leash in her magic. "Thanks, Fluttershy," she said, smiling at the timid Pegasus. "I really appreciate your help." "You're welcome," Fluttershy said softly, smiling back. "Just make sure to take good care of him. He's such a lovely-looking human after all." The pair hugged before Twilight led me out the door. Fluttershy stood in the doorway, waving at us as we walked away. The rest of the afternoon was spent going to various shops across town. At some I was allowed inside, while at others I was forced to wait outside. We stopped by a store that was called Human Smart. I had to resist the urge to smash my head against a building at that. Twilight bought a bed that looked very similar to a large dog bed from back home. Along with the bed, she bought a couple of blankets. She also bought 2 bowls, which I'm assuming were meant for water and food. There is no way in hell I'm crouching on the floor to drink. She also bought some toys, much to my horror. They were similar to dog toys back home, except they weren't themed for dogs. There were balls, some knotted ropes, frisbees, and some squeaky toys. I think I died a little inside as she bought them. We hit a few more shops after that, including an astronomy store that made it clear that there were no humans allowed. I was forced to wait outside for nearly an hour as Twilight drooled over the telescopes. It was during these periods when I was left outside by myself that I tried to memorize the town as best I could. If I ever managed to get away from Twilight, I wanted a clear escape route. After Twilight finally emerged from the astronomy store, we continued our store hopping, each one as strange as the last. It was at one particular shop, the one shaped like a gingerbread house, that I spied a large sign with the words, "Welcome to Ponyville," emblazoned on it in large gold letters. At least I now have a name to go with this crazy town. Ponyville. Another punny name. Or is it a pony name? A punny pony name? I was still musing over that when Twilight emerged and retrieved me, leading me to the next store. I didn't even taste the food she had bought for me inside. We arrived back at the library just as the sun was going down. Entering the building, I sat down on the floor, rubbing my feet. Twilight latched my leash to the wall, then proceeded to empty her saddlebags, carrying the objects she bought to their appropriate places. She hummed to herself. After placing my new bed on the ground near the wall the leash was attached to, she entered the kitchen. Glancing around lazily, I noticed a small desk in the corner of the room. I perked up as I noticed what was on it. Scrolls. Ink and quills. I immediately stood up and made for the desk. I had just about reached it when my neck snapped back, the collar choking me. I glanced behind me in confusion. I groaned at the sight behind me. I had reached the end of my leash. Grabbing it, I pulled it taut, trying to get a couple more inches out of the wall, but to no avail. Turning back to the desk, I reached an arm out, grasping for the material. It was just out of my reach. Straining, I tried harder and harder to reach my intended target. My fingertips had just brushed against the scroll when a shout behind me startled me. Something tugged on the leash, causing me to fall backwards on my ass. Looking around, I was confronted by an angry Twilight. "No, those are not yours," she said sternly. Walking to the desk, she wrapped one of the scrolls in her magic, smacking me in the back of the head with it. She gathered up the rest of the clutter covering her desk, quickly storing the material in the shelves above it, well out of my reach. She continued to glare at me as if I had just insulted her in some way. Turning towards me, she pulled out the toys she had bought at the human store and waved them in my face. "These are yours! You can play with these!" She threw one ball at me, putting a little more force behind it than was necessary. It bounced off my head, falling to the floor between my legs. Tossing the rest of the toys on the ground, she walked over to where the leash met the wall. Twilight then proceeded to shorten the length of the leash before turning off the lights and heading up the stairs. "Now you stay down here and behave. I have a letter to write." With that, she disappeared upstairs, leaving me alone in the dark. I sat there, glaring up at where the mayor had disappeared to. She had just crossed the line. I had been in this goddamn place for 2 weeks. For 2 weeks I have been treated like shit, Forced into a small cage for too long, barely fed and forced to watch as the humans were neutered and branded, with the knowledge that there was nothing I could do if they decided it was my turn. What's more is the fact that every attempt I had tried at communicating with the ponies had been thwarted by them, albeit the attempts weren't many. For 2 weeks I have had to deal with this bullshit, and I had had enough. Fine, if they want to treat me like an animal, I'm going to start acting like one. A sudden pressure in my lower stomach made me realize something. I haven't had the chance to go to the bathroom yet. From what I saw today, most humans did their business outside. With Twilight now resigning herself to her room for the night, I doubted she would be letting me out anytime soon. Unable to reach a bathroom or nearby window, that had left only one option. I wasn't happy about it, but I've seen my dog do it several times, and if I was going to act like an animal, I might as well do it too. The urge growing, I looked around the dark room, spotting my prey just within my reach. I smiled. Standing up, I descended upon the poor rug. This should wake her up in the morning. And that was Chapter 6 of Your Human and You by Madmaxtheblack. There will be a link in the description below to lead to his story. Read by yourself or read along with me. There will also be links to my social media sites so that way you can get in contact with me, ask me questions, and or just chillax and hang out with me. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and as always, I will see you all in the next video.